Good afternoon, everybody, and wow, thanks for coming. When we planned and arranged this, somebody said there are 3 bad news about this panel. 1, it's after lunch. 2, it's almost at the end of a 2-day intense conference. And 3, it's about Syria. So I'm really impressed that you all came, and many thanks for coming and to listening to our panelists for another important, I think, discussion and panel about Syria. My name is Ralf Südhoff. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action, Germany's first think tank on humanitarian affairs, CHA. And I'm supposed to say that I'm delighted to host this panel. That's actually not true. I'm really thrilled to host this panel for a couple of reasons. 1, a personal reason. I was based myself in Jordan, in Amman, until end of last year with the UN World Food Programme, managing Syria Crisis operations from there. So there is a personal touch, but that doesn't always help. And you are very lucky that I'm your facilitator only. 2 weeks ago, I sat on a panel myself on Syria, and I think I was frankly the most boring and depressing panelist ever, because I couldn't really get over it anymore. Another discussion on Syria, and it seemed like things get worse and worse. So I'm very happy, for one, that we have a much more inspiring, encouraging, and I'm sure in many ways a much more knowledgeable panel here, because on this panel are sitting the people who should talk about Syria. For a start, 2 Syrians will talk today about Syria. And we have Sara from Jordan, who knows the region and the whole crisis and the setup so much better than probably most of us will, including me, will ever do. When this session was designed, nobody expected it to be such a hot topic in the news with the Turkish offensive, which hadn't started until like a week ago, as you all know. And there wasn't a sign that the humanitarian suffering could restart in this area, then one again up in the northeast, and with all this news up there and the changing news and all the impacts also on the political side. So what we have jointly discussed, what we thought might be the most interesting and important topics to discuss today, until you are, of course, more than invited to join the discussion and raise whatever you like, are basically 3 things. 1, starting with the hot news. What is the humanitarian situation in the northeast, and how does it impact the work of humanitarians on the ground, and how does it impact the people, as we hear so terrible news about that? Second, how does all that relate to the humanitarian situation and the work for humanitarians in Syria itself, and what might be the interlinkages in the near future? And third, what's the political impact of that, and how does it go, might it go further, and what is based on that the key ask of our panelists, what we from our wide, most of us, sorry, not speaking for everybody, from our wide Western perspective should do, how should we follow up, what could the German government do better, and many of our panelists here on the panel and others have talked to the Germans over the course of the last days. If that sounds fine for everybody, still, I hope, I'm more than honored to introduce our 3 panelists. First of all, we have Sara Kayyali from Jordan, sitting in the middle. She's the Syria researcher of Human Rights Watch and a lawyer, and lobbying the German government, for example, on the situation, on the terrible situation in Al-Hol last days. Please give a warm welcome to Sara. Then we have next here, next to me, Rita Dayoub. She's associate at the Chatham House in London and the founder of the initiative Health Workers at the Frontline Storytelling. And she will share a bit of what that means and how we can all benefit from that. Originally, she's from Salami province at the heart of Syria and has been working with ICRC in Damascus until 2014. Plus, she's a dentist by profession, but a very nice person. Please welcome Rita. Finally, Fyras Mawazini, the Vice President of Doctors of the World, originally from Aleppo, And today, and was based in Amman for years. He knows the Arab world by heart. You almost forgot Amman, I sense. But it's, you have been in the region for quite a while, and an impressive CV in Tunisia, Morocco, and you know all the Middle East and everything coming with it so well. Warm welcome to Fyras, please. Fyras will giving us an interview in the first place on the humanitarian situation in the northeast and in Syria as a whole, so we all know what we are talking about. Fyras, 200,000 people already affected by the fighting in the northeast. We had a briefing last days in our think tank on the Syria conflict with the regional coordinator. He indicated 600,000 people might be affected pretty soon, so it might get even from worse to worse. In that context, we all know MSF needed to stop operations. Almost all NGOs, apart maybe from some local stuff, can hardly work anymore, but you will tell us about your organization. Please give us an overview, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ralf. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this panel. Well, very quickly, if you could put the map of the Northeast. I mean, you've been following the news for the last week. I mean, it started a week ago with the Turkish military operations on the northeast of Syria. Very quickly, things happened, and more than, well, you said 200,000, but I think it's 300,000 people were displaced, going south and east of Syria, for some, to some extent, trying to reach also the Syria-Iraqi border. 500 people died, of whom apparently 100 civilians. But I would say the most important indicator is that since 3 days, all the international humanitarian actors left the area. And what is interesting is that they have left, of course, because of these military operations, but not only, mainly because of the coming back of the Syrian regime presence in the area. Because most of these INGOs are illegally in Syria. They're not registered in Syria, for most of them working in this area. They were dealing very much with the Kurdish authorities in place. And now that the Syrian regime is taking back power over the region, they have definitely to go back to, through certainly registration with at Damascus level, and with all the complications that it will bring, having them, I mean, to a certain level to deal with the Syrian authorities, knowing the difficult and the potential manipulation that could happen behind. But maybe what's happening on the north is just a new phase in the conflict, a new phase of the humanitarian situation in Syria. So I wanted to go back very quickly on some of the figures. I mean, for me, what is very much representative of the Syrian humanitarian situation are the figures. I mean, it was certainly one of the biggest refugees crises. So, I mean, 1/3 of the people left the country. So the total population of Syria is about between 20 to 22 million. And up to 7 million people left the country very quickly during the 3 to 4 years of the conflict. So it's enormous. I mean, 1/3. It's quite incredible. Another third, 7 million were displaced internally. So we're reaching 14 million who were very heavily, directly affected by the situation in Syria, by the conflict in Syria. But not also to miss the others, because the other third remained in Syria, but were very much also affected by the conflict and living in very harsh conditions throughout the time of the last 8 years. I mean, hard conditions, I mean, access to electricity is almost impossible for many of the people in Syria. I mean, they have to pay quite high price to get electricity. Access to water is almost also impossible. It's getting different a bit these last months, etc., in some big cities, but still it's quite a challenge. The prices, I mean, the Syrian pound was before the war, €1 was equivalent to 50 Syrian pound. Today, €1 is about 600 Syrian pounds, and so You can imagine the jump in the prices and how life is becoming very expensive in Syria, as much as expensive here, by the way, but the salaries remained almost the same than previous to the war. Other figures that I feel are also important, the number of deaths. It varies always between 350,000 officially up to 1 million, and we believe it's certainly much more than that. The number of disabled people, according to UNICEF recently, 1.5 million people are today disabled because of the conflict in Syria. So, and you know how it is difficult to live as disabled in a country where access to all the main services are almost impossible. The people in prisons, I think the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights based in London said up to 200,000 people were in prison. So, and we know how the conditions are in prison. We know also that there's absolutely no, for most of their families, there's absolutely no news of the prisoners inside the prison. We don't even know if they died or not. So it's quite also a very, situation which is more than just difficult. Then imagine of the number of children affected. Millions of children were born during the last years in Syria. They grew up in a war country, so you can also imagine the type of spirit that is developed and the type of situation for the children. Many of the children were out of school, up to 3 million, according to UNICEF, etc. So, no childhood for most of them. So, above all that, the Syrian people had the feeling that the international community abandoned them. And that was so difficult for the Syrians to see through the very beginning of the conflict, asking for the support of the international community and repeating it. And you remember all the images of every Fridays, people in the street asking for the support of the international community, and the feeling that the international community has totally abandoned them. So this is also quite heavy on the Syrians. One, and last but not least, is that the current situation, that is, when you get back the regime almost taking back control of all the state, except Idlib at the moment. And what's happening in the north is that the big winner will be the Syrian regime, the current Assad Syrian regime. The feeling to come back to a regime of the reign of fears and terror. The people do not speak anymore inside Syria. They're and they're to a certain extent not accepted, but they just say, okay, well, this is what happened, and now today we have to go back and again have this regime in place. So the people do not speak anymore, and if you speak, it's becoming like before the revolution, like you fear for your life, you fear for your family, and etc. And all the Syrians outside are fearing to go back. And they fear for the people inside when they, express their ideas on social networks, etc., or when they give their opinion. I will stop here for the moment, but happy to develop more after.
Great, many thanks, Fyras, for the comprehensive overview. Rita, you have your own story in this conflict, which made you flee, and that made you also work on this topic, both from a health sector, if I understand correctly, plus on a very special initiative, how to make the people heard. Please share with us your experiences and your views.
Thanks, Ralf, and thanks for everyone here. It's an honor to be here. So I think what I will be doing is to give another dimension to the figures that Fyras just mentioned, which is to share a few stories with you. I love a good story. I love telling stories. I love to be told stories. I think it's amazing. I left in 2014 to study in London, and I worked overseas. I worked in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, also with the ICRC, and now I'm an academic associate at Chatham House. And my main focus is on one of the main reasons of the disruption of humanitarian services in Syria and in many other contexts in the world, which is attacks against healthcare. When hospitals are being bombed or health workers are being killed or targeted because of their medical work, or when medical supplies and medical transfers are being delayed at checkpoints or are being targeted as well. So all of the political and security reasons that will hinder the delivery of health services. And unfortunately, we see this in so many contexts, so many conflict zones, but Syria is an extreme. We have more than 500 health facilities have been targeted, bombed, or almost completely out of service at the moment because of these systematic targeting of health facilities. We have more than 900 health workers killed in the conflict. These are the figures according to Physicians for Human Rights, and since 2011. The issue is ongoing. All parties to the conflict are committing these atrocities, and no one is being held accountable, unfortunately. And the types of these atrocities are really varied depending on the area, depending on who is committing them. However, the most damaging one has been the fighter jets attacking and bombing hospitals. I will come back to this point in a moment, but we also see a lot of abductions of health workers. I just want to add here that health workers, and particularly surgeons and doctors in Syria, are really, really important in the society. They are usually the part of the community leaders. They are highly respected. It is part of the social norms in Syria. So targeting them and abducting them means a lot to the society, to the communities, beyond depriving these communities from the much-needed health services. I also want to add that the focus on health services is not because the other humanitarian services are not important. They are extremely important, and unfortunately we see systematic targeting of schools and other services as well. However, with health services, I just want to mention here that it is extremely costly, and it requires a lot of complicated logistics to be delivered, and it requires long years of training. So when we lose one doctor, we are not only losing the doctor, but we are losing so many lives that could have been saved by this doctor. And I'm not speaking only about doctors, I'm speaking about all health workers and everyone working in the health sector. So I've been working on this with the ICRC. There is through the project called Healthcare in Danger. And I started a small initiative that is a storytelling initiative. It's called Health Workers at the Frontline. The main reason why I started this initiative is because I am really tired of numbers. And when I arrived in London and when I travel in Europe, speaking in conferences or speaking to friends or through my daily life, I realized that it's so easy, it has become so easy not to relate to the stories behind these numbers. So when I say 900 health workers have been killed, this is probably a figure that you will forget when you leave. And I wanted to bring the real stories of the people behind these figures. So I collect audio stories from health workers, not only in Syria, but in other conflict zones, but I'll focus on Syria now. And I will stop talking myself. I will give you the opportunity to listen to two health workers. The first one is the audio file up there. He is a surgeon from Idlib. He has been the director of one of the hospitals in the northwest of Syria. And he will tell you the story how he has been displaced several times. And every time he's displaced, he will re-establish a hospital in the place where he's displaced. So,
Yes, the hospital where I work, which is currently called Al-Sham Central Hospital, which is supported by the UN, was bombed last month on the 5th May 2019. I'm a surgeon in this hospital and have been the director of the medical hospital for the last year and a half. This hospital has a long history of bombardment. It was called Hana Central Hospital, and it was located in Hazareen area near Kefren Bell. We were bombed several times between 2013 and 2015. The last one caused the death of a nurse from Kefren Bell city, alongside several critical injuries amongst the patients. This pushed us to relocate the hospital to another area called Abdeen, which was in an underground cave with walls more than 10 meters thick. It was also bombed several times. The last one was with extremely explosive missiles, which penetrated through all 10 meters and resulted in the martyrdom of 4 people. 3 of them were a family, a mother, a father, and a little girl who came for a bowel obstruction surgery. She was in a residency room. In addition to them, there was a follow-up patient who came with a broken femur. These 4 were martyred, and 1 other staff in the hospital was injured. The hospital was almost completely destroyed. This pushed us again to relocate the hospital into Al-Sham Central Hospital, which is in an underground building on the outskirts of Kefrenbel city in an olive grove.
So he's highlighting basically that because it's very unsafe to have a normal hospital overground, they are moving into caves. They are trying to relocate the hospitals into caves, and even the caves have been targeted. And there is a running joke, which is not funny at all. I hope you don't laugh. But for example, in besieged Aleppo in 2015, one of the hospitals needed to relocate because it was targeted, and the only location where that they found was close to a military checkpoint. And the soldiers at the military checkpoint, they panicked and they needed to relocate because they knew that once they established a hospital there, that they will be targeted. So the hospital is more targeted than the military checkpoint. So it tells us a lot about these dangers. I just want to highlight that although you will hear a lot of stories about, like you will think that it is really dark and it's really, it's really sad what's happening. But these stories, and I do encourage you, if you're interested, to go to the website and listen to them. Well, they are in Arabic, but you can find the transcriptions in English. It's called healthworkers@thefrontline.org. They are stories of resilience and bravery. And sometimes when I talk to them and I ask them maybe if they want to talk about a certain thing, like related to the political situation or what's happening, they will be like, Rita, we don't want to talk about this. This is rubbish. We want to talk about another thing, like the dish that we really miss and we can't have at the moment. And I think it's beautiful because it's so important to relate to what is happening and to know that what is happening there is really so human, and we can all hopefully relate to that. And this brings me to the next story, who is a Kurdish health worker in a town called Afrin, and she is now displaced because of the recent offense that Fyras just talked about. I mean, Afrin is a predominantly Kurdish town in the northwest of Syria, and it has been attacked several times. But she will share her story instead of me.
What makes me feel unsafe is in the mornings when I go to work, not knowing what awaits me on the way. Would there be an exchange of fire, shelling on the road? When I arrive at work, I'm always worried, what if something happens to my house? A bombardment or something else? How am I supposed to get there on time for my daughter? At the same time, I cannot leave my daughter in a nursery or anywhere to take care of her, because if I leave her there and any of the problems I mentioned do happen, I won't be able to reach her. Therefore, as much as they might take care of her, a mother's care is different. I will always need to be with my child, like all mothers. I'm sure we all have similar problems, particularly working mothers. At work, we experience a lot of problems with people in uniforms who think that they have priority because they are part of a certain armed group, that they should not queue and that they should not be registered, even if the doctor has the maximum possible number of patients. There's always this idea that they should be prioritized because they are armed. This makes us feel very unsafe, despite the guards and the management. Whenever there are weapons around us, we'll be afraid. We try to tell ourselves that it's okay and that they won't hurt us, but you never know what they might do if they get angry. We have the same concerns on the way back home, clashes and explosions. We cannot go out to buy what we need because we don't know if we find a car bomb or step on a mine. We don't know what awaits us. We cannot go for a walk or work properly. There are all these issues that make us feel unsafe in all of the places where we go.
That's it. The stories are in Arabic, but hopefully there will be the English translations on the website soon. These are the voices of my friends and colleagues at Chatham House, so you will hear in the translations all the different accents of the UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Thanks so much for bringing these voices to us, and thanks for telling your story and putting a face and a voice to the numbers. Let's be frank, it's for everybody an 8th, 9th year we watch this crisis, and you know all about it and are so touched to it. So it helps a lot always to hear this and to learn again. This is about people. Sara, you work about these issues very much about the human rights angle even on it, and going beyond the humanitarian assistance issues. So you have a lot of analysis on what the situation in Syria is in these conflict areas, but also much beyond, because there is a whole of a country which is government controlled, where the situation is changing, and where a lot of challenges, especially on the human rights side. So over to you to brief us.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I realize I'm a bit of an outlier as a human rights advocate in a humanitarian community, but actually my intervention is going to be about why I'm not an outlier. The Syrian conflict is easily one of the worst humanitarian crises we've seen in modern times. And no matter what anyone says and what we see on the news, it's been 9 years of the worst suffering imaginable for a large population in the Middle East. And you see other crises trying to catch up to it, but Syria, I think in our eyes, is special. But I think the point to be taken from this is that humanitarian crises don't happen in a vacuum. They don't happen because 13 million people are in need, just because they want to be, or 7 million have been displaced because that's where they want to go, right? You don't see people trying to smuggle themselves across the Turkish border by climbing border walls and getting shot at not once, not twice, but 13 times because, hey, the shopping in Turkey is better than it is in Syria, right? And I think that's a key point for us to keep in mind as a community that's after one aim, and that's to ensure that these civilians are able to live their lives with dignity. So I'm going to actually talk about three sort of examples that showcase how human rights are very intertwined with humanitarian crises. And we can build a school, we can build a hospital, we can provide tons of food into these areas, but until we resolve the root causes of the conflict, which are very much tied to the human rights violations that the Syrian population had witnessed even before 2011, we're only going to be putting Band-Aid on a bleeding wound. And we see this in the northeast, where the Turkish armed factions arbitrarily arrest and extrajudicially execute not just humanitarian workers, but activists and civilians who are innocent. We see this in northwest Syria, where the Russian-Syrian military alliance has systematically targeted hospitals, schools, and displacement centers, infrastructure that is protected by international humanitarian law and human rights law. And the failure to hold these parties accountable for these violations has meant that they've done it in 2013, 2014, 2016, and 2019. So I can rebuild this hospital 6 times, 7 times, but unless they're held accountable, there is no way that you can resolve a humanitarian crisis from its roots. And then finally, we look at areas that are held by the government, where many countries are now claiming that the situation is stable, where you see increased access in terms of humanitarian access. But guess what? The Syrian security services continue to arbitrarily arrest and mistreat and torture humanitarian workers, medical workers, former people affiliated with the opposition. They create so much insecurity that many organizations, humanitarian organizations, including the ones represented here, are unable to claim that they have full access to the communities in need. Especially when you see people, and I'll address this in more detail in a later intervention, when we talk about returns. Is it safe to return to Syria right now? And I think the overwhelming answer is no. And it's not no because there's bombing there. It's not no because there's shelling there. It's no because there is no due process. It's because if you're at a checkpoint and you upset a guard at that checkpoint, you're likely to be not just arrested, but disappeared or tortured, and your family would know nothing about you. So I think there is a lot of linkages between what it means to violate human rights in a conflict like the Syrian conflict, and why in 2019, 8 years after the conflict started, you still have 13 million people in need and a larger humanitarian response than ever before. I'll stop there, and then maybe if there are any questions.
Many thanks, Sara. Very, very impressive overview. Many thanks for sharing. Fyras, I'm sure you have something to add on the points Sara made, but at the same time, I would like to ask you on some good news after I made a big effort to depress everybody with my questions and pushing you into all the bad news so far. When we discussed yesterday, you shared a lot of good news about the local efforts on the ground, how much locals can do, how much we tend to oversee that all our humanitarian machinery and assistance and appeals and blah, blah, are overseeing what is done on the ground, and that the big effort is indeed done by locals. Maybe you can share a bit on that, and of course on the situation overall as described by Sara. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I don't know if it's a good news, but at least it is a kind of a system in place. I mean, knowing that there was no more, I would say, a kind of a so-called state taking charge the services for its population, a lot of parallel systems were initiated and created by the Syrians themselves. We talk a lot about the humanitarian interventions of the international NGOs, which is very important, and definitely the international NGOs are, I mean, they know how to how to provide services. They know how to very quickly respond to refugees crisis, to IDPs, etc. But what the Syrians have developed throughout the time of the conflict is also very interesting, and we don't talk enough about it. I mean, I believe we don't communicate enough about the extreme efforts done by the Syrians themselves. I mean, going from very small local initiatives, I mean, in the neighborhood, between family members, etc., up to, for example, large-scale operations such as the one from the White Helmets that you all certainly know. I mean, and this is what, at the same time, allowed the Syrian people to survive and to develop kind of resilience. I mean, it's definitely an interesting term here, because, you know, very quickly when the conflict went on, in the neighborhood, people started to say, well, we have to organize ourselves. We have to find ways to get water, to get electricity, to get food, to secure the area, etc. So very quickly, local committees were put in place to ensure the certain security around the neighborhood and to provide the main services, etc. Very much also families organize themselves to support each other. I mean, a lot of the Syrians who left the countries gave their houses to neighbors, gave their houses to family members who were touched by, where a neighborhood was bombed. The other day you will find the family moving into another neighborhood where they have family members, and so they can stay in their houses, in their apartments, etc. So a lot of initiatives were really much initiated at the very local level. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that when you're in such a situation, the most important and what really allows the people to resist and to stay is these local initiatives. And at the same time, it's interesting, the White Helmets experience, you know, the White Helmets experience that they decided they were, you know, everyone was just witnessing the heavy bombings that were happening on a regular, every hours, every days, every night on cities such as Aleppo, Homs, Dera, etc. And people started to say, we have to do something for the people here. I mean, we have to organize ourselves to provide the emergency support, etc. So they, you know, they're just people like everyone, but they decided to a certain extent to put them efforts together and to organize themselves. They asked for training. They wanted to know exactly how we could provide those emergency responses. some international partners supported them, trained them, etc., and they became the white helmet, the civil defense forces. I mean, to a certain extent. I mean, they were known everywhere, and so they were very heavily targeted. Exactly what you were saying. I mean, the health facilities were targeted because, to a certain extent, the regime wanted the people to go out. You know, I mean, as long as you don't have the health services, then you start to look for another place. So you were moving. People were displaced from one. You know, they not only one displacement. They have lived displacement after displacements, and many of them from not just neighborhood level, but at the also governorates level. So they moved from Aleppo to Idlib, from Idlib to another one, etc., etc. They were moving all around the country looking for a safe place. So I think also, for example, the international NGOs, they have relied a lot on the Syrians. I mean, they were not able, after 2013, most of the international NGOs left the country, those who were not in Damascus, registered under the regime, and who, to a certain extent, accepted to work under the regime influence. They were only able to provide the support inside because of their Syrian staffs. Many of us, as NGOs, we had hundreds of people providing the services in all the different areas where Syria, where the needs are important.
Maybe a quick note on the localization topic, to frame it that way, to follow up on that one. 1 year ago, this Congress was about humanitarian assistance and localization, and there was a big call for pushing this topic. And I'm not sure much has happened since then, which is not the fault of this Congress and the audience. But we are in a situation where not much is moving in this direction overall, and neither inside Syria. And one of the key arguments why this is very difficult and controversial is, well, especially in conflict settings like inside Syria, it's very hard to find local actors who are neutral, impartial, and follow the humanitarian principles. When we hear what you tell us, how do you take this comment? Is that a valid one, or is it just a reason not to move?
Well, I don't think it's very much valid. I mean, you know, people, they were in a situation, it's to a certain extent, it was not anymore to take any position because they wanted to, to survive. They wanted to keep living. So, if you were moving in displaced areas under the opposition will organize itself to bring the services. The same on the regime-controlled area. The regime will somehow manipulate the international aid coming into the controlled areas to provide the support to people who were somehow in support of the regime. So there's always this type of manipulations happening on the ground. One point important is the Syrian diaspora. You know, the Syrian diaspora also organized itself to support the people inside. You have the old diaspora who left the countries like 40, 30 years ago. They were educated in Europe for most of them, and they set up international NGOs, Syrian international NGOs, and they very quickly served as partners of the international NGOs inside Syria because they have the networks inside. But also the recent diaspora, the one that left the country mainly in 2015, you know, they all ask for refugee status in Europe and all the places around. And from the very little amount of money they would receive at the very beginning, before starting to work and to integrate in the country, they were sending the money to their families. I mean, most of the support today coming inside Syria is coming from the Syrian diaspora. It's a bit an example of what happened during the Lebanese war, and the Syrian regime knew that when they pushed out the 7 million Syrians. In their mind, it was also, you know, those 7 millions will support those inside. So there was a kind of in a way, the Syrians never retained the people. They opened the borders and they let everyone through out.
Rita would like to comment on that one.
Yeah, I would like to challenge what you mentioned.
Please.
Well, it's not a challenge. I think saying that the local health, I think that the local communities are the first-line humanitarian providers, by all means. The international humanitarian organizations are so much in the light because they have access to. They have access to media, they have access. But the first people to respond are the locals, and they are usually the families and the communities, and they are usually more trusted, and everyone knows them. And this is where people will go for help, and it will take years for the people to have trust in any internationals coming to this area. What I want to challenge is that I don't think that. I think there are very few examples where the local health providers or local humanitarian providers have different principles than what we know as the international humanitarian principles. I think they use different language. The principles of helping everyone who is in need, which is basically what humanitarianism is all about. We're speaking about humanitarianism. We're not speaking about assistanism, which is different. It's something that is shared in almost all the cultures, that they have elements of that, and almost all religions, they call for the help of the people in need. I think they just use different terms, and knowing that they use different terms doesn't mean that they don't share the principles. So I think we have a gap in the dialogue between the international humanitarian providers and the locals in the different communities, and we need to agree that the language might be different, but the principles and the practices might be the same.
Very good, interesting point. I mean, also in the light that there are estimates that like 80–90% of humanitarian assistance in any given crisis is provided by local initiatives, which are simply not covered and not looked at. Maybe coming back to the current humanitarian situation, and a final question for Fyras. With the developments in the northeast, there is a lot of fears and talks that a key element how to provide more or less even assistance inside Syria to the greatest extent possible has been cross-border. And a lot of operations coming from Turkey inside Syria, and previously, as it's been done from Jordan, from the south, when I was based in Amman, to ensure that the opposition-held areas get access to humanitarian assistance by the UN and NGOs. This could come to an end if Damascus is taking control of more or less all of the north, apart from Idlib. Will this be, do you expect this to be a key game changer in this crisis? Are we moving into a new period of the Syria crisis in this 9th year?
Thank you for this question. Many of the INGOs rejected or didn't want to register in Damascus to continue the cross-borders operations. I mean, one of the elements, if you want to register in Damascus, is you have to stop the cross-border operations. Very few were able to do the both. I mean, I won't give any name, but they had good relations to be able to do it. I mean, today, most of the humanitarian needs are along the borders. So northeast, northwest, and south, along the borders, where most of the displacement happened. So most of the aid is coming through the cross-boarding. I mean, stopping that will definitely change also the demographic issues. I mean, how people will move after that. How, if we stop the cross-border operations, people will go back certainly around cities and resettled around Damascus, Aleppo, etc. So I don't know to what extent today international NGOs are ready to move into the next steps. The so-called reconstruction, I still believe we're in a new phase of the conflict. The conflict is not over. It's been almost 9 years, but it can last so much more. I mean, we have seen it in different countries around. So now there is definitely a problem, an ethical problem at the INGOs level, how to remain impartial, knowing that if you want to operate inside Syria in the coming months, you will have to deal with the regime. And that's definitely a point. It's because the regime will impose you where to work, restriction of areas. The regime will, will definitely undermine your independence and partiality. They will impose the local partners. So they will tell you, you have to work here and here with this type of organization. And they will prevent you from, doing assessment, needs assessment, monitoring, evaluation. They don't like these data issues. So when you move around in the field and you start to ask questions, straight away you have people from the different security forces ask you, why are you asking these questions? What are those questions? So they don't. So all those will be very difficult for the international NGOs to provide the right support. And then there is this political game around it. I mean, the regime knows that they need to control the humanitarian support, the humanitarian aid. So either the one that is coming from the Syrian diaspora, all the money flowing inside Syria. So they have a huge control also of those that are, bringing the money in. And also in designing the populations inside the cities, how to manipulate and try to bring certain communities in certain areas and displace others, etc. So yeah, I don't see a bright future, to tell you frankly. I don't see it easy, because it also put into questions these ethical issues for the NGOs.
Thank you, Fyras. Sara, you have so much experience and so much research done on this topic. What happens if the government of Damascus is taking control of parts of the country? You've analyzed it when it happened in the south, when the access from Jordan, as mentioned, stopped and it all got under government control, and what it means in political human rights terms, what it means for people returning or having been displaced. So what would you expect, given that the government was, in a sense, in a victory mood before, and now it might take the northeast and have its alliance with the Kurdish? What might that mean for all the work you are doing and your findings?
Thank you for that question. So Human Rights Watch, for the last year or so, most of the work that we've done, in addition to looking at areas of conflict, has been trying to understand what it means when the Syrian government retakes an area. And our findings display that there continue to be significant human rights violations, much like the ones that we had seen in 2011, but even more egregious in a sense, both because the situation in these areas is very unstable, but also because there's no insight into what is happening. So as opposed to 2011, when you had hundreds of witnesses to these violations coming out that you were able to interview, being able to understand right now what goes on in areas held by the Syrian government has become far more difficult. But what we were able to find is that there are three categories of human rights violations, and I'm going to frame these in terms of return, because I think this is really an important topic. A lot of European countries, a lot of host countries are urging refugees, Syrian refugees, to return. But how can you urge Syrian refugees to return when we don't understand what is happening on the ground in areas retaken by the Syrian government? So what we've tried to do as Human Rights Watch is actually answer this question. And for example, what's happening in the south, since the Syrian government has retaken that area, is that Syrian security services have created this sort of fiefdom, where each security service controls a certain area. They restrict access to this area, but they've also conducted scores of arbitrary arrests. They've tortured people. They've prevented people from accessing their homes. What's happened in Rita or Aleppo since the Syrian government has retaken these areas? You've had wide-scale demolitions of neighborhoods that are previously associated with anti-government groups. So we're talking about Qaboon, we're talking about parts of Al-Qusayr, we're talking about parts of Daraya that have been completely destroyed under this reconstruction framework. And I think the most famous iteration that I think a lot of you would know is Law 10, which was passed by the Syrian government in April of 2018, which essentially allowed the Syrian government to unlawfully confiscate property without providing adequate compensation to people. Among the most vulnerable population that was affected by this law are returnees. What we're seeing now is that the Syrian government is ad hoc implementing this policy by demolishing neighborhoods. And they haven't demolished these neighborhoods through airstrikes or in response to ongoing conflict. They've demolished these neighborhoods after they had retaken these areas. And we have satellite imagery to prove it and witness testimony from inside Syria that tells you, hey, I returned, I tried to get to my home, but it was demolished, it was on the ground. And when we asked them, why did this happen? They had no idea. They have not been provided with alternative shelter or adequate compensation. So this is a huge and ongoing crisis inside government-held Syria with very little light shed upon it because the international community generally wants Syrians to return to where they came from, as do, I think, to an extent, the Syrian government and Russia. And then the ongoing practices in detention facilities. In 2013 and in 2014, we documented the use of systematic torture and inhumane conditions in detention facilities. To this day, this is ongoing. This has not changed. Because it's out of the spotlight, because it's difficult to do something about it, people no longer talk about it. But it's a live issue, and it's something that impacts the prospect for return immensely.
Thank you, Sara. Very impressive. Rita, you are perfectly well positioned to put all this into context, given your Syrian background and your work at Chatham House. There was a lot of talk about an overall shrinking humanitarian space, and Syria only being maybe one of the prime examples. If you look at your work on the health sector and what happens in Syria, but compare it to the research you've done on other countries, is that a valid observation, or how would you frame it?
Can I just add one thing
to
what Sara just said? I mean, unfortunately, we still have also a lot of ex-detainees or ex-political activists who still live in the regime areas in Syria. And I will speak about access to health services. A lot of them who still suffer from certain health conditions related to their torture in the prisons. They are really afraid to seek health care, and they are literally trapped. They don't ask for health services because they're afraid whenever you go with a certain conditions that is directly linked to the torture, it becomes extremely risky to seek health care because the hospitals are infiltrated with security services, and it's they don't feel safe doing that. And I want to just pay tribute, this my position here at the stage, to pay tribute to one of my best friends who was killed under torture. He is Dr. Ayham Ghazzoul. He was killed under torture in 2013. And we only knew that he was killed 2 years after his death. And that happened by chance when one of the inmates who was with him in the cell kind of was released miraculously, and he managed to contact the family. However, his mother is now here in Berlin, and she is working with other mothers and other families of Syrians to seek justice in the German courts. So hopefully with the support of the German people and with continuous work, we will get some accountability. So for now, we can't have justice in Syria, but at least, I just want to tell you that we're trying. So, yeah. Now back to your question. I want also to link the shrinking of the humanitarian space to accountability. And I will give another example, what happened in Kunduz, in an MSF hospital in Afghanistan in 2015. It was bombed by the American army, and we lost so many friends and so many patients and so many colleagues who were working in this hospital. And what's now 4 years? 4 years since this incident happened. And correct me if I'm wrong. Up to my knowledge, so far we couldn't get an independent investigation in what happened, and the American government and the American army is refusing to have an independent investigation. They said that they have an internal one. So what message does this send to the rest of the world if the American government is not supporting? If this is happening at that level, then in other regimes that are less, let's say, in Syria or in South Sudan and other countries, what example are we setting for them. If there is no accountability, then yes, these violations, these atrocities will continue, and we are not holding anyone accountable. So this is ongoing, and as Fyras and Sara mentioned, we have to have some sort of accountability for this to stop. It is not enough to keep building hospital, and it is not enough to relocate hospitals every time it's bombed. And unfortunately, we see this happening in most of the other conflict zones. I think in the morning session, there were some talks on what's happening in the Ebola crisis in DRC, where MSF Ebola centers have been attacked for different reasons because of the sensitivities with the communities. But it is happening, and the consequences are very similar. We see this happening on wide scale in South Sudan because there is no particular protection for civilians, so the consequences are really catastrophic for the population. I think a very good start would be to really take the accountability very seriously. One last point on Syria is that we think, well, there was in August, Antonio Guterres, he initiated a board of inquiry to look into, to investigate what had happened in Syria, where there are so many health facilities have been attacked, but like 5 of them had been part of what we call the deconfliction process in Syria, which is a process where health facilities or health organizations share the GPS coordinates with UN OCHA based in Gaziantep. We're speaking about the health facilities in the northwest of Syria. So they share their GPS coordinates with UN OCHA, which in turn shares these coordinates with all the parties of the conflict in that area. 5 of these facilities, and the reason is supposed to be to protect them. The reason is supposed to be that the fighter jets, when they are bombing others, say, okay, there is a hospital here, we will spare it. Now, at least 5 hospitals have been bombed, were part of this deconfliction process. So now there is a board of inquiry. It is not very transparent, to be honest. We don't know who is going to work there. We don't know what they are going to do. We only know, to my knowledge again, I know that they feel so unsafe to go and visit these health facilities. Accountability is a very good start. That was a very long answer to your question, right? Okay.
But a very interesting one, and many thanks also for sharing this very personal story in the beginning. I think before we do a final round, when I would be keen to ask you what you expect from us, from the West, what's your key ask, what do you hope for, what the German government should do better and different, or what we all should engage in. It's really time to open the floor. So many people have been listening patiently, so I hope some mics are flying around. Well, I can hardly see you, to be honest, in this spotlight, but now it's getting better. Are there any mics over there? Okay, maybe we start back there. The gentleman with a blue shirt raised his hand, first place.
Thank you so much for your inputs. My name is Hana. I'm a Syrian medical doctor, and I was the head of WHO office in Aleppo between 2013 and 2016, and also a volunteer with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent back then. I think we all agree in this room how hard the situation in Syria and that the humanitarian situation in Syria is one of the most complicated maybe in the history. And what I feel is always missing when this is being mentioned, the positive inputs. So it would be nice, and interesting to hear from you, what are the humanitarians doing in Syria? What are the achievements? What are the lessons learned? What are some positive inputs from the side of the humanitarians that they are responding to problems, challenges, and achieving some goals? Yeah, it would be nice to hear it. Thank you.
Many thanks for this question, asking for more good news as well. Maybe a woman over here, but I can hardly see hands raised. No woman raised his hand?
I have already.
Okay, please go.
Thank you very much for the information.
Sorry, where are you? We can't hear.
Here.
Ah, okay, sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much for the information about the humanitarian situation in general.
Sorry.
I have an additional question to you. It's about possibility or difficulty to provide humanitarian aid in the opposition-held areas. The opposition-held areas are shrunk now to the province of Idlib, and they are in a very difficult situation. And what would be for me interesting, we see the attacks from the government and from the airplanes, but there's also another very difficult situation because most of this area is held or controlled by the militia of al-Nusra and this following organization, which are declared terrorist organizations by the UN and the Western countries. And now what kind of difficulties are provide this for the humanitarian aid in these areas? We had previously a panel which have shown how difficult it is with the anti-terror regulation by the Western countries for the donors. How behave the donors respective this humanitarian aid to the opposition-held areas because of these facts?
Thank you. Maybe a few more. The lady over there in the black dress, please. And then up here.
Hi, Maria Mola. So I was working in NES within the health cluster system. So my question is really focusing around what are the advocacy elements that you can get, particularly from, like, say, Human Rights Watch or from Chatham House. We've seen previously in reports, say from Chatham House, actually, the Humanitarian Response Plan is at times propped up by the Syrian regime, where they get a look in and actually affect the humanitarian action. So what can we do, particularly when so many different methods of weaponization have been used, say like attacks on healthcare, weaponization of water, direct sort of civilian attacks? What can we do more on the research side in terms of advocacy? Thank you.
Thank you. Kayo, here the third row, raised his hand very early, please.
Hi, my name is Kayu from the German organization HELP. A few comments and maybe also a challenge. One is not all NGOs retreated from the Northeast. There are a few left that are still operating despite the Turkish incursion, one. Second, I think what the Syrian conflict showed us in a very cynical way altogether over the years is mainly that the tools that we use are not fit for purpose anymore. When it comes, for example, to international humanitarian law, it's very important that this exists, but it's not doing anything for us. Then the next point is that the definitions of who is a civilian, who is a combatant, is not clear, and it's not fit for purpose anymore. Who is a humanitarian actor and who's not? You were talking about the white helmets. White helmets only operate in opposition territory, and white helmets have surprisingly no search and rescue tools. Almost no, but every single one of them has a dash cam on the helmet, which costs a lot of money, you know. And then you can ask yourself, really, like, where's the priority of this organization? And I think that this makes this conflict in particular so complex because you don't know who is who and who is doing what. There are long lists of people who are working for different NGOs in different parts of the country that are, but and at the same time they work for different militias. They're on the paycheck of militias. So, and when is this person not a civilian or a humanitarian aid worker anymore? Like, is this from 5 to 6 or at what time? You know, this makes things very complicated. And yeah, that's basically it. Thank you.
And the final one here, maybe you can just hand over the micro.
Sorry, one more point. Sorry. As a humanitarian, I think I know everybody, even every humanitarian has an opinion on the Syrian war regarding the factions. Every single one. Regarding the factions, who you're in favor of. But as a humanitarian, I would like to call you to use the humanitarian terms, which is not regime and it's not revolution. It's armed uprising and it's government of Syria, which is defined by the humanitarian community. Thank you.
Yeah, Tankert Stöbe, MSF. My question is, well, just a reminder, back in 2002, we worked in hospital caves and were bombed back then. Yeah? So for me, bombing hospitals or health facilities is quite a sort of typical thing from the onset of the crisis in Syria up to today. And my question is for you, because I think we have quite a good monitoring of bombing of hospitals until 2016, but in the last 2-3 years, at least to my knowledge, the documentation and the monitoring of bombing of health facilities was less systematically done. Can you say something about that? Thanks.
Thank you. So we have 5 questions, and feel free to pick whatever you like. Please share good news. That would be great and inspiring. Maybe you can finish on that note. The Idlib challenge and the counterterrorism issue, which is surely an important one. We heard a lot about it in the session before, but Syria is a special case. The question on the cluster and the methods from the cluster colleague on the methodology side. Who is who in this conflict, and what does that mean, how to deal with the conflict? Surely also a bit challenging what we discussed on the local actors side, and finally on the documentation and how can that be still done, for example, for the health sector. Rita, you look like you would be keen to start.
Yeah, I'm trying to start. Can I ask my friend there? So why is it important to know who is who? Why?
Don't give him the floor again.
Well, I won't. But why is it important? I mean, I know one thing. I am a health worker. I'm a dentist. Sorry for everyone who hates dentists. But I'm also an oral surgeon. I don't care if who is the patient. It doesn't matter. And it should not matter because I mean, you mentioned this yourself. If we are humanitarians, if we're providing humanitarian services, we shouldn't care who is the patient, and we shouldn't care who is providing the service as long as they are providing it impartially. Now, the question here is that what to do if humanitarians are providing these services partially, and if they are using these humanitarian services for political and for political reasons or as a warfare. This is what I would say a different question. But I don't think it is important to know who is the patient because we are not there to judge. And I speak specifically from a health perspective. We should not really, I mean, we had an oath and we should not really think about who's the patient. I will just come back to the last question because that was directed to me, and it's about documentation. I think we are now documenting even better than before, unfortunately, and this is just, like a hint at MSF. MSF's file, Medical Care Under Fire, is dying. Why? Please revive it. The issue is still there. Please revive it. I know that the ICRC is still documenting in a more systematic way than before, but the data is confidential. The Healthcare in Danger program is ongoing, and it's now documenting. Yeah, it's still ongoing. We have the surveillance system of WHO, which is online. It's a public platform. However, unfortunately, WHO, it's a very poor system where we can't find any information. It basically says there is a hospital in Syria that was bombed. It doesn't give us any information. I would say there are the diaspora health organizations, particularly speaking about Syria. Syria has been, let's say, because of the scale of this issue, particularly the diaspora, is it you? The diaspora health organizations that Fyras spoke about are systematically also collecting information about what's happening, and we have also Physicians for Human Rights that has a very solid methodology in the documentation, and there is an interactive map on their website. So I would say there has been a lot of focus on documentation, and I think we should now think beyond documentation. We have enough evidence and numbers. We should think beyond documentation. So I'm happy to, if you would challenge me on that. The follow-up is definitely lacking, and I would come back to the accountability point. I think we should now focus on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On the name of Ralf, thank you.
Is it working? Yes. Thanks for making this work again, and thanks for your contribution. Sara, maybe you will be happy to touch on some of the questions, and maybe also on the question, what do you expect talking about accountability? How optimistic are you? There is a political will to make the key people accountable. What's your forecast on that front? Thank you.
Yeah, just sort of quickly on the diversion in areas held by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or Jabhat al-Nusra, because this is something that I had actually done research on very recently. Parts of the difficulties that these humanitarian organizations operating in northwest Idlib are facing. Violence is definitely one of them, and active hostilities, but restrictions placed on them by donors because of the potential for diversion and the fact that these entities are listed is probably the major thing that I heard across the board from all the humanitarians that I spoke to. And I think I spoke to every local Syrian organization that was operating in northwest Idlib around a month ago. And just sort of, it's one point that I wanted to make to this is that the way Hayat Tahrir al-Sham diverts aid, it diverts, there are examples of it diverting funding, say, related to women empowerment, related to education, but not related to, as far as we could tell, not related to the provision of services or shelter. Because they're also very keen on sort of maintaining governance. There is this thing that it's called like an atawi, like a tax where they take some tents or take some baskets. But you as humanitarians, I think my understanding is that this happens quite regularly in all contexts where you're engaging non-state armed actors. And just sort of a final point linking that to innovation from the humanitarian aspect, like good news. There's not much, unfortunately, but one of the things is their risk analysis and risk mitigation by local Syrian organizations is impeccable. I've seen nothing like it. It's actually, and it's something that INGOs could do well to learn a lot from. And that's something that I think goes to the good news, but also goes to the accountability. These kinds of organizations have gone under so much attack that they've developed systems and policies that are really worth learning from, including on duty of care and risk mitigation. And they've learned to hold themselves accountable. On the question of accountability more generally, yes, I mean, we are hopeful. In this business, all we do, especially on Syria, despite everything that comes out, we're hopeful. And we're hopeful precisely because of the innovation that we've seen in terms of accountability. When the resolution to sort of refer Syria to the ICC was vetoed by Russia and China in 2016, the UN General Assembly stepped in to create the IIIM, which is a semi-prosecutorial body that's mandated to hold parties to the conflict inside of Syria accountable and build cases towards that. When there's no domestic prosecution of people who are involved in these atrocities and violations, the universal jurisdiction principle, which is a legal principle, was reactivated actually in Sweden and in Germany, among other European countries, where now you get to hold Syrians accountable in domestic courts in Germany and Sweden for the violations that they committed all the way in Syria. That is legal innovation, and that's, I think, at least goes to show you the political will for accountability. A final example on this, which seems to sort of not be mentioned in these circles, is on chemical weapons use. When Russia vetoed the joint investigative mechanism to investigate and attribute responsibility for the use of chemical weapons inside Syria, the OPCW as a whole expanded its mandate to allow it to attribute responsibility. And you don't see this kind of innovation except in a situation that's as desperate as Syria.
Thank you, Sara. Fyras, you have now the very easy task, as we have overrunning already, in 2-3 minutes to share a bit on, if you may, On the Idlib situation and the counterterrorism issues, if that's fine for you. I mean, it's definitely a big challenge, but maybe we can do that also bilaterally if that's easier and if you prefer not to comment. To share some good news and maybe a wrap up, what do you hope for?
Well, thank you. Well, first I would like to thank those who asked the questions, especially the Syrian friends. I mean, it's important to have such debates between us sometime. Of course, you're right, Northeast, I mean, there's still some NGOs, especially Syrian people working with NGOs. I mean, when I said the left, especially the expatriates, I mean, the international staff left the Northeast. And it's also interesting you're asking who's who. Well, I don't read, I mean, it's not so important because, I mean, we never really ask who's who when we provide cares. It's so important not to ask because otherwise you start to be really much into a manipulation question. But you know how the white helmets, they're only able to operate in the opposition held areas because in the governmental held areas they are terrorists, considered as terrorists. So I mean they will be jailed the minute they enter into certain areas, or they have to change the operational modes. I don't know, maybe you have more information than I, but on the, I want to be, on the optimistic and good news, of course, I mean, there is always good news around. I mean, first, I would say that the Syrians were not so much known outside of Syria or outside of Lebanon, Jordan, I mean, the very close area. And now, since that time, they are well known all over the world. I mean, it's incredible how people are, knowing much more of the Syrian people, and this is a very positive aspect. I think it's very important that today the Syrians, every Syrian outside is a kind of ambassador to Syria, and they are spread all over the world. I mean, each one of us has his family members spread between America, Europe, Middle East, Gulf countries, up to Indonesia and Malaysia. So we're spreading the words of what Syria community is. Now you're all in Berlin eating Syrian foods. So you start to know exactly what Syrians are, how the mentality is, etc. And I think this is very positive because it helps also in terms of thinking about the future and the reconstruction. Other positive aspects is that all those Syrians who left, they are willing to come back, not to come back in the current situation, but they have also had the chance to have a different type of education, access to education that allows us to think differently, etc. And I think this is very positive. So, I mean, for the future, I'm quite positive, not in the current months to come or years, but definitely for the next generations. I hope there is huge hopes to come and that there is good news that will come definitely. And maybe to finish on I mean, the humanitarian support is always important, whenever it is. It's not because it's there is this counterterrorism issues that we should stop our operations. We have worked throughout the country, even in areas held by, I mean, the humanitarian actors, international actors, were also able to provide the support in areas controlled by ISIS. Why? Because there is civilians there is people living there. So as long as there is a need for the civilians, we have to be present. We have to stay and deliver. I think this is the most important, to find the ways to stay and to develop kind of also resilience and to rely much on the local level. That's more important.
Thank you so much, Fyras. Rita. 30 seconds, please.
No, there is a question that we forgot to answer. It's about the research, the lady there. I think we've aggregated a lot of data. It would be great if we can work on analyzing this data. I see a gap in providing a scientific evidence of what is happening. I think spatial analysis is extremely needed, but I mean, to get to this point, to get enough resources to do spatial analysis, that will be extremely difficult. But also, it will be very important also to have comparative analysis between the different countries and the different types of violence that are happening. I just have two very quick comments. Can I do them? For my friend from SARC there, thank
20
you for,
seconds.
Okay, thank you for your comment. I mean, it's sad that we need to provide humanitarian work in the first place, right? And there is a lot of great work being done there. I mean, a lot of it. And yes, we don't talk about it as much as we talk about the what we need to do, what we need to do, what we need to do. And I wonder sometimes, and this is a philosophical question for all of us, all the humanitarians or non-humanitarians here, are we setting the bar too high? Do we really need to provide, like, is this realistic, what we really want to achieve or not? So I'll just throw the question to you, because I feel sometimes that I'm exhausting myself, just aiming to do everything that I can and do, I don't know, like 100% of what is needed. I wonder sometimes if this is just impossible, if this is, you know, maybe it is just not possible. Stop, shall I stop? One last thing about the counterterrorism issue. The counterterrorism, the international and the European counterterrorism regulations so far, I haven't been able to attend the other session, but they do not say clearly that we, like, speaking here particularly about freezing the funding to going into areas controlled by what is considered as terrorist groups. The international and national and European regulations do not state clearly that the funding should stop once a terrorist group is controlling the area. It's the chilling effect that is happening there that is causing so many donors to freeze their funding, and it is having, you know, like catastrophic humanitarian consequences. There is a lot of work to be done on clarifying these regulations, making them clear that they kind of do not interfere and do not cause more catastrophic consequences on the populations because of their chilling effects. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Rita. I think in the beginning I mentioned how skeptical some people have been if a Syria discussion in the 9th year could be interesting. If you see the audience which is skipping its coffee break right now and hardly anybody left, you get a sense, I think, that people found it very interesting and are very grateful for your presence. At least I was moved by what you told us and I learned a lot. Thank you so much, and I think it's now only time to thank you for coming and to wish you for your extremely important work all the best, and all the best for your home country and the region. Thank you.